Discipline. The word evokes images of willpower, control, rigidity. In popular view, being disciplined is synonymous with having a strong ego, capable of mastering impulses and imposing order on one's life. For this reason, indiscipline is seen as a weakness of character, a moral flaw. But this is a simplistic and superficial view of the workings of the human psyche. When one observes people's actual behavior more closely, it becomes evident that this explanation does not hold. Why do so many fail to maintain discipline, even with motivation and clear goals? Why do healthy habits fade after weeks or months of effort? Why do goals that initially seemed important become burdensome and unbearable over time? The answer to these questions lies not only in willpower, but in the hidden structures of the psyche. Depth psychology shows that human beings are not governed solely by their consciousness. There exists a vast unconscious that houses desires, memories, fears, and archetypes which operate independently of conscious intention. The ego, the conscious part of the psyche, does not control the entirety of the being. On the contrary, it often ignores or represses unconscious content that, by remaining unrecognized, manifests autonomously. It is precisely here that the true root of indiscipline resides. It is not merely a lack of effort or laziness. It is an internal conflict, often invisible, between conscious will and the unconscious forces that follow their own logic. When these conflicts are not recognized and resolved, blockages, self-sabotage, and a constant feeling of fighting against oneself arise. Furthermore, modern culture imposes a model of success and productivity that reinforces the dissociation between the persona, the social mask that the individual presents to the world, and the true self. Many try to maintain an image of discipline and control to meet external expectations, but internally, they live disconnected from their own deep desires and needs. This misalignment generates tension and psychic fatigue, making discipline an artificial and unsustainable effort. Therefore, building true, solid, and lasting discipline requires more than organizational techniques and willpower. It demands deep psychological work, the integration of unconscious content, the confrontation of the shadow, the alignment between persona and self, and the harmonization of psychic energy. Only when there is this internal balance does discipline cease to be an imposed burden and begin to flow naturally. This video explores 7 psychological laws that help to understand the deep mechanisms that sustain or sabotage discipline. Based on the principles of analytical psychology, these laws reveal why so many fail in their attempts to discipline themselves and how it is possible, through inner work, to build an unbreakable discipline. It is common to imagine that, with enough willpower, any habit can be formed, any behavior can be maintained. This belief permeates self-help books, performance training, and motivational speeches. But from the perspective of analytical psychology, this approach is naive and doomed to failure, because the willpower of the ego does not operate in a vacuum. It interacts with the entire psychic system of the individual, and this system is profoundly shaped by unconscious contents that cannot be ignored or simply repressed. The unconscious is not a passive repository of forgotten memories. It is a dynamic field where autonomous forces, desires, complexes, archetypal images continue to act and influence behavior. Many of these forces, having been rejected, repressed, or never integrated into consciousness, end up manifesting in distorted ways, in impulses, in lapses, in symptoms, in invisible resistances that undermine conscious efforts. When a person tries to impose discipline without first having integrated these unconscious contents, they inevitably encounter internal sabotage. They feel a growing tension, an inexplicable fatigue, a sudden aversion to goals that once excited them. It is not that they do not want to be disciplined. It is that a part of them, an unconscious part, resists the command of the ego because it has not been heard, has not been understood, has not been integrated. Furthermore, the greater the repression of these forces, the greater the risk that they will express themselves in uncontrolled ways. The individual tries to force themselves to follow a rigid routine of study, work, or diet, but suddenly finds themselves overwhelmed by compulsions, procrastination, irritability, or even psychosomatic illnesses. These symptoms are not mere character flaws. They are signs of an unresolved conflict between the conscious and the unconscious. True discipline, therefore, is not built through imposition, but through integration. Before attempting to shape their behavior, the individual needs to explore their hidden motivations, understand the desires and fears that operate in the shadows of the psyche. It is necessary to recognize the rejected parts of oneself and work to integrate them into the conscious personality. Only then does the will of the ego cease to encounter resistance and begin to flow in harmony with the whole psyche. Without this integration, any attempt to impose discipline will result in cycles of effort and failure, of guilt and frustration. Psychic energy will remain divided, consumed by internal conflict, making each habit a battleground. But when unconscious forces are recognized and integrated, discipline ceases to be a constant effort. It becomes natural, sustained by an internal agreement among the various parts of the psyche. This is the first and most fundamental principle for building unbreakable discipline. But it is not the only one. There are even deeper forces that need to be understood, and one of the most powerful is the self-sabotage that arises from the rejected self. And that is what we will discuss in the next part. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Among all the phenomena that undermine discipline, self-sabotage is perhaps the most insidious. It is not an external enemy. It is not the environment, nor the lack of time or resources. It is an internal, silent movement that seems to arise from nowhere. An invisible boycott that prevents the individual from moving toward their goals. However, from the perspective of deep psychology, self-sabotage is neither random nor irrational. It is an expression of the rejected self. Each person carries within their psyche parts that have been repressed or denied throughout life. Desires deemed unacceptable, forbidden emotions, unresolved traumas, facets of personality that, because they do not fit social or familial expectations, have been relegated to the unconscious. These parts do not disappear. They continue to exist, charged with psychic energy, and seek ways to manifest. One of the most frequent forms is precisely the sabotage of discipline and personal progress. When the ego tries to construct an idealized identity, a self that is disciplined, productive, controlled, it often does so at the expense of these rejected parts. The result is an internal conflict. The rejected self does not accept being ignored. It acts as a compensatory force, bringing contrary impulses, creating distractions, generating self-destructive behaviors. Not out of malice, but as an unconscious attempt to regain psychic balance. Therefore, the more rigid the effort to discipline oneself without integrating these parts, the more intense self-sabotage tends to be. A typical example: a person decides to adopt an extreme productivity routine, denying their needs for rest, pleasure, or emotional expression. At first, they may even maintain discipline for a while. But gradually, resistances begin to emerge. Laziness, procrastination, compulsive distractions, irritability, loss of motivation. It is the rejected self-claiming space. And if this movement is ignored, it tends to intensify, completely sabotaging the disciplinary project. Thus, true and sustainable discipline can only be built from the reconciliation with the rejected self. This requires inner work of recognition and acceptance of these hidden parts. It is necessary to embrace the aspects of the psyche that have been denied, understand their origins, and give them a legitimate place in the psychic life. Only then can the energy that once fueled self-sabotage be redirected constructively. This is a delicate and profound process that cannot be resolved with superficial formulas, but it is absolutely necessary for those who desire a discipline that is not a constant battle against oneself. Because as long as the rejected self is not integrated, self-sabotage will continue to act, subtly, persistently, inevitably. But there is an even deeper step in this journey. Even after recognizing the rejected self, the individual needs to reach a level of psychic development where their discipline does not depend on constant effort, but arises from an authentic alignment with their true self. And that is what we will discuss in the next part. For analytical psychology, true discipline is not a product of blind effort or repression. An unbreakable will is not built simply by imposing rules and forcing behavior. The deep foundation of discipline lies in the process of individuation, the path through which the individual seeks to integrate all parts of their psyche and become what they are in essence. Individuation is not a concept of superficial self-improvement. It is not about becoming an ideal self or following an external model of success. It is an inner process of recognition, acceptance, and integration of all aspects of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, persona and self. As the individual progresses on this path, their will ceases to be fragmented and begins to align with a deeper and more authentic psychic center. Most people live in a state of internal conflict. The ego wants one thing, the unconscious wants another. The persona demands a certain behavior, the self demands a deeper sense. This fragmentation drains psychic energy and makes discipline a battleground. That is why so many personal projects fail, not due to a lack of desire, but due to a lack of internal coherence. When the individual advances in individuation, this situation changes. By integrating repressed contents and dissolving false identifications with the persona, they begin to experience internal harmony. Their psychic energy, previously scattered in conflicts and resistances, starts to organize around a central axis, the self. The will becomes more fluid, more consistent. Discipline then no longer requires Herculean effort. It becomes a natural expression of a more integrated psychic being. Furthermore, individuation brings clarity of purpose. Often, indiscipline arises because the individual pursues goals that do not correspond to their true self, objectives imposed by society, family, or culture. This creates a disconnection between the superficial wanting of the ego and the deeper motivations of the psyche. The result is resistance, disinterest, fatigue. In the process of individuation, the individual learns to distinguish between authentic desires and external conditioning. Thus, they begin to invest their energy in projects that truly make sense to them, where discipline flows much more naturally. Therefore, real discipline is not an effort against oneself. It is the fruit of a more integrated, more coherent psyche, more aligned with its deep center, and this is only achieved through individuation. But even with this growing alignment, there is an aspect of the psyche that, if not faced, will continue to exert a powerful and hidden influence over behavior: the shadow. And as long as the shadow is not integrated, it will have the power to compromise even the most well-intentioned projects. This is precisely what we will discuss in the next part. The shadow. In Jung's thought, this concept is central to understanding how the unconscious influences human behavior. The shadow is composed of all aspects of the psyche that the ego rejects, denies, or represses. Traits, desires, emotions, impulses that the individual considers unacceptable, shameful, or incompatible with their self-image. However, the fact that they are rejected does not mean they disappear. On the contrary, the more they are pushed into the depths of the unconscious, the more power they acquire. And it is here that one of the greatest obstacles to building true discipline resides. As long as the shadow is not recognized and integrated, it acts autonomously, sabotaging conscious behavior. It is behind many impulses of escape, distraction, and compulsive indulgence. It fuels patterns of procrastination, addictions, and disproportionate emotional reactions. No matter how much the ego tries to control itself, if the shadow is not confronted, it will find ways to manifest. The problem is that most people live in denial of their own shadow. They cling to an idealized image of themselves, reinforced by the persona, the social mask they present to the world. In this image, there is no room for weaknesses, for desires considered inferior, for dark impulses. But the price of this repression is high. The psychic energy of the shadow, excluded from consciousness, accumulates in the unconscious and generates increasing tension. And the greater this tension, the more uncontrollable impulsive behavior becomes. In the context of discipline, this means that as long as the individual does not take responsibility for their shadow, they will continue to be surprised by behaviors that contradict their conscious will. For example, someone tries to adopt a rigorous work routine, but finds that, in moments of stress, they repeatedly give in to the pursuit of immediate gratifications, food, entertainment, consumption. Another tries to maintain a disciplined training regimen, but constantly sabotages their own effort with excuses and delays. These behaviors are not simply a lack of willpower. They are expressions of the unintegrated shadow seeking its space. Integrating the shadow does not mean eliminating or purifying these aspects. It means recognizing them, understanding them, accepting them as legitimate parts of the psyche. It is a process of deep self-knowledge that requires courage and honesty. When the individual does this work, they reduce the unconscious power of the shadow. The energies previously spent on repression and internal struggles become available for more coherent and conscious behavior. Discipline then ceases to be a battle against hidden impulses and becomes a more natural expression of integrated will. This is an essential step on the path to unbreakable discipline. But there is a subtle trap that many face even after starting to integrate the shadow: the trap of the persona. Because even with some self-knowledge, it is easy to continue acting from a mask, trying to appear disciplined without being truly aligned with the self. And it is about this trap that we will talk in the next part. Many individuals who repeatedly fail to maintain discipline ignore a decisive factor: the misalignment between the persona and the self. To understand why this misalignment sabotages discipline, it is first necessary to comprehend the nature of these two forces that inhabit the psyche. The persona is a social construct. It arises from the need to adapt to the demands of the environment, be it family, the professional setting, or culture. From an early age, the individual learns what is acceptable, what is valued, what is socially rewarded. Over time, they develop a mask, a social identity built to generate acceptance and avoid rejection. This is not a conscious falsehood, but a fundamental adaptive mechanism for human coexistence. The problem is that this persona often crystallizes, becoming a prison. When the individual overly identifies with it, they lose contact with their self, the authentic core of their psyche, which includes both conscious forces and the deep unconscious elements of their true nature. In other words, the persona is what the individual presents to the world. The self is what they truly are. When discipline is sought from the persona, the result is an artificial and fragile discipline. The individual is not acting in accordance with their deepest motivations, but is trying to sustain an image. They commit to routines, goals, and behaviors that serve this social image: the disciplined self, the productive self, the successful self. But since this discipline does not arise from an authentic alignment with the self, sooner or later, the effort runs out. Maintaining this mask requires an immense amount of psychic energy. Each small deviation from the idealized persona is perceived as a threat to self-image and, by extension, to the individual's social value. This generates anxiety, rigidity, perfectionism, and guilt, states that drain willpower and increase vulnerability to self-sabotage. Furthermore, when disciplined behavior does not resonate with the authentic values, desires, and needs of the self, the unconscious reacts. It manifests in subtle forms: chronic demotivation, feelings of emptiness, loss of meaning, boredom, destructive impulses. The psyche seeks to restore the broken balance, attempting to undo the false image constructed. And discipline, sustained only by a mask, cannot withstand this internal pressure. On the other hand, when the individual aligns their persona with their self, discipline becomes a natural expression of the integrated psyche. There is no chasm between what one is and what one presents to the world. The chosen goals are coherent with the deepest needs, and the formed habits correspond to an authentic sense. In this state, psychic energy flows more freely, and willpower is reinforced by a feeling of internal congruence. This alignment is not trivial to achieve. It requires a conscious process of self-knowledge, deconstructing unnecessary masks, and reconnecting with the true aspirations of the self. But it is an essential step for those who desire solid discipline that does not depend on constant effort to be maintained. However, even when the persona and the self begin to align, there remains a central challenge: unresolved internal conflicts. These conflicts, between opposing desires, between contradictory parts of the psyche, continue to undermine willpower persistently. They create a field of psychic tension that drains energy, generates fatigue, and makes any disciplinary effort a hard and exhausting struggle. For discipline to become truly unbreakable, it is necessary to learn to identify and resolve these internal conflicts. And that is exactly what we will discuss in the next part. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Among all the factors that silently destroy discipline, internal conflicts are perhaps the most lethal. They are invisible forces that erode willpower from within. As long as these conflicts remain unrecognized and unresolved, any attempt at discipline will be permanently weakened, subject to unexpected failures and constant relapses. But what exactly are these internal conflicts? They are not merely superficial doubts or momentary indecisions. They are deep divisions within the psyche itself, clashes between opposing desires, between incompatible beliefs, between different parts of the self that have never been integrated. The ego may wish to follow a path, establish a routine, achieve a goal, but at deeper levels of the psyche, other forces, equally legitimate, may desire the opposite. It's like trying to row with only one oar, while an invisible current pulls in the opposite direction. These conflicts do not arise by chance. Often, they are the result of a history of repression, unresolved traumatic experiences, complexes formed in childhood, inherited unconscious patterns. Parts of the psyche become stuck in time, carrying emotions and beliefs that do not fit the current conscious life. When the ego tries to impose discipline without first resolving these psychic knots, resistance appears, not in an open and conscious way, but through fatigue, procrastination, irritation, sabotage, and loss of motivation. The more intense the internal conflict, the greater the energetic drain. It is important to understand that willpower is not an unlimited resource. It depends on the available psychic energy. And when a significant part of that energy is being consumed by the struggle between opposing internal forces, there is little left to consistently sustain disciplined behaviors. This is why many individuals experience a cycle of exhaustion. They start a new habit with great enthusiasm, but within a few weeks they feel drained, unmotivated, and unable to continue. It is not a lack of character. It is a sign that there are internal conflicts draining the life force. Furthermore, these conflicts generate a state of emotional instability. Mood swings, fragmented focus, and weakened sense of purpose ensue. The individual feels divided, without a clear internal axis. In this state, discipline becomes almost impossible to maintain, as each action requires disproportionate effort. The solution is not simply to try to push harder or apply productivity techniques. This only intensifies the tension and weariness. The path is different. It is necessary to identify these conflicts, understand their origins, and work to integrate and resolve them. This is a deep process of self-knowledge and psychic integration. When internal conflicts are dissolved, the previously blocked psychic energy is released. Willpower is renewed. Discipline flows much more naturally, as there is no longer an internal war sabotaging every movement. But there is still a fundamental principle that crowns this entire process: the relationship between energy and meaning. Because even after resolving conflicts, integrating the shadow, and aligning persona and self, discipline only becomes truly unbreakable when actions are connected to a deep meaning. And it is about this essential law that we will talk in the next and final part. After everything that has been said so far, an essential truth emerges. No discipline, no matter how well planned or technically structured, can sustain itself in the long term if it is not connected to a deep sense for the individual. The human psyche is not a machine that operates solely on rational commands. It is driven by meaning. Where there is no meaning, there is no life. And where there is no life, there is no psychic energy to sustain disciplined behavior. This is one of the great misconceptions of many modern productivity approaches. They try to teach people to be disciplined through mechanical methods, task lists, rigid schedules, all disconnected from the deeper reality of the self. The result is an empty discipline that soon runs out. Because psychic energy, what Jung referred to as libido in the broad sense, only flows sustainably when it is in service of something that resonates with the self. Something that makes sense on an existential level, that touches the most authentic fibers of the soul. When what one does lacks this meaning, work becomes arid, monotonous, heavy. Willpower quickly wears out. But when there is a deep connection between action and meaning, the energy seems inexhaustible. It is no longer necessary to exert Herculean effort to maintain discipline. The very flow of internal life sustains the movement. Tasks are not just obligations, they become expressions of a broader purpose. Therefore, the final step, and perhaps the most decisive, in building an unbreakable discipline is the pursuit of this alignment with meaning. It is to ask, honestly, why am I doing what I am doing? What is the deep value that this goal, this habit, this routine carries for me? And if there is no answer, if what is being done does not resonate with anything authentic, perhaps it is time to reevaluate one's own choices. Because no amount of effort can compensate for the absence of meaning. This is the path that leads not only to a stronger discipline, but to a fuller, more coherent, more truthful life. A life in which daily behaviors are not mere mechanical repetitions, but authentic manifestations of an integrated and conscious self. Now that you have understood these 7 psychological laws that support unbreakable discipline, it is time to reflect. Which of these laws resonated most with you? Where do you feel you still need to work more deeply in your own process? Leave your comment below. Sharing your insights is a powerful way to consolidate learning and inspire others to do the same. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and continue watching the upcoming videos. They are also essential for deepening this journey of self-knowledge and transformation. Don't miss out. Each piece of this knowledge is important.